Howdy. Welcome back to the Hinterlands. It's been a while. I had a few different videos in the works that I wanted to be my follow-up video. I recorded, I don't know, at least 3, maybe even 5 videos that have ultimately gotten turfed because too much time passed between when I recorded them and when I was going to around to edit them. I moved. You can see I've got a new setup behind me. So a lot of stuff's happened, but I do want to keep making videos, and my setup has degraded a bit. As you'll see, the video and audio is not what it was in the first video. That's because I'm recording on my phone instead of off of my computer right now. I just want to keep making videos, and once I've started making videos consistently and keep at it, then maybe I can justify spending a little money on better gear and a better setup. But first things first, make the videos and then spend the money if you keep making the videos. I think that's a good policy. So anyway, I'm going to start off by talking about 3 short story collections that I read a while ago now, back in March, but I haven't talked about them yet. On the blog, I feel like I've alluded to 2 or 3 of them, maybe even referenced them directly. 2 of the 3 books are going to be probably referenced in some capacity in my year-end list for 2026. Really happy with them. The third one is still also good and interesting. We're going to talk about them all right now. So first book I want to talk about, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World by Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison is an iconic short fiction writer of the 20th century, science fiction, fantasy, horror. He kind of lives in the space between all of those genres. He's maybe most strongly associated with science fiction just because that was the genre that dominated in the era he emerged in, the kind of the new wave of the 1960s in American science fiction. In the 80s, he goes on to be associated with horror because of the horror boom post Stephen King, the kind of paperback boom. And then stories like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream kind of get him into that horror zone as well. And he's always been a bit of a horror writer as well as a science fiction and fantasy writer. He in these stories, a few of them are like distinctly science fiction stories and build on the traditions of pulp science fiction, but some of them freely move kind of between the genres and explores places where science fiction has always been kind of perhaps infected by fantasy, that the American science fiction tradition, as much as for the long time in the 20th century, science fiction sold and fantasy didn't, but ultimately what sold was the branding of science fiction. The content very often included many grains of fantasy, and obviously as time went on and science fiction turned out to not be depicting the science of the future, a lot of it was purely fantastical anyway, which is, kind of the point. Ellison is well known for being a kind of a acerbic individual. He is a guy with an attitude. He had strong positions. He wasn't afraid to be nasty to people. He kind of has a reputation for being hard to work with, but at the same time, he had many strong friendships with people he either mentored or came up with. He was fiercely defensive of people who he respected. And in general, his anger was directed at the kind of people who held power in the science fiction community at the time. As a member of the so-called New Wave, he got a lot of pushback from the New Wave in general. Was attacked by a lot of the kind of gatekeepers of the 40s and 50s, the kind of golden age and post golden age writers who stood up for who kind of were defending what they perceived as traditional science fiction from the new wave writers who were interested in interiority, psychological realism, literary techniques. And Ellison was part of the vanguard of that. And indeed, as being a little older than some of the new age writers, ended up being a champion for the movement in general. And so this collection literally says on the back, 15 stories of tomorrow from science fiction's angriest young man. So to give you an idea of how he was perceived at the time, and not necessarily incorrectly, like the kind of anger and the kind of just general rebelliousness, I think, comes through really strongly in these stories. These are stories about pushing back at the kind of pre-60s American monoculture, the kind of the nuclear family, the white picket fence. He is not afraid, and in fact is a little gleeful about taking an axe to all that, especially in the final story and one of the more famous stories from the collection, A Boy and His Dog, which I really liked, and I'll talk a little bit about towards the end. So yeah, the collection as a whole is quite good. There's a wide variety of stories. Like I said, they move between fantasy and science fiction and horror. They kind of weave these different strands together. There are some fun stories like Santa Claus versus Spider, which is a kind of the original What If Santa Claus Was a Badass story, which involves Santa Claus having to kill the kind of leaders of an alien conspiracy that's conquered the earth by possessing kind of notorious right-wing American political figures of the late 60s and early 70s, which is pretty great and gives you a sense of kind of where Ellison's politics were at the time. Probably my favorite story of the whole collection is Along the Scenic Route, which is about a kind of a stereotypical unsatisfied suburban couple who are driving in a near future or a future highway with hover cars and stuff, and like a million lanes. And the gimmick is that at any point, two drivers on the road can engage in vehicular combat in a kind of organized manner with a league. And the man lets himself be goaded into a fight against a pimple-faced teen who's the deadliest driver on the roads in his kind of and then the suburban guy just has like kind of a slightly souped up family car. It's very nasty, very cynical, and pretty funny. I quite liked it as well. Probably the most famous story of the collection, A Boy and His Dog. It is incredibly grim, incredibly cynical. It's a post-apocalyptic future with kind of psychic dogs and people, or kind of street urchins. Everybody lives on the surface. Is kind of these irradiated, murderous children who kind of hunt in packs and work with dogs. And there's lots of gangs and then there's kind of a suburban dystopian societies and silos deep underground. It's kind of about this boy who's the main character, who's like 12 or 13, coming into contact with a girl from one of these suburban enclaves. I do think this story is a huge influence on something like the Fallout series, with its kind of this ironic tone to an apocalypse, and this kind of the combination of the horrifying grimness of the future with the kind of narrative of a character who simply lives in it, and so it's just normal to him, creating a sense of irony and a dark humor, which I think it's a fraught story. There's lots of horrifying stuff in it, but I think it all works, and I ended up being quite impressed by it. Second collection I want to talk about, The General Zapton Angel by Howard Fast. Howard Fast is an interesting figure. He was a prolific writer across all kinds of genres in the 20th century. He was not strictly a science fiction fantasy writer. He is a prominent leftist, went to prison rather than name names after getting called in front of HUAC. And the collection reflects it. They are a prime example of kind of 20th century left-wing speculative fiction, which is something coming in English out of the United States is particularly rare, especially because the magazines were largely controlled by editors who were staunchly right-wing types, and much preferred the kind of libertarian kind of politics of people like Heinlein and Poul Anderson. Of course, coming from the 60s and 70s, there would be much more diversity in the kind of politics of science fiction, the new wave, as I've been talking about, opened up all that. And this collection actually came out in kind of the middle of the new wave, kind of coming 70, 71, somewhere in there. The stories in this collection, again, a mix of science fiction and fantasy. They tend to be a little more almost like allegorical or fable-like in tone, which is not my favorite, but also I think Fast does it quite well. It's a very strong collection, and it feels a little out of sync with the kind of pulpier, both the pulpy kind of stuff that you expect from like pre-new wave science fiction, and the it doesn't really feel like they don't really feel like new wave stories either. He's clearly doing his own thing, and I think that has to do with just he wrote in so many different genres, so many different publications. He was not limited to just this science fiction fantasy space, and so you get a really different kind of vibe from his work compared to a lot of other stuff. The titular story, The General Zapped an Angel, the premise is it's the Vietnam War, and an angel came out of the sky, and General Blaster blasted the angel down. He zapped him. And it's about kind of the U.S. military kind of, they've got this corpse of an angel killed, and they just don't know what to do with this giant dead body of an angel. It's cool. It's great. It's a great story. It's so like, this is the thing about Fast, is like the kind of stories are kind of just so on the nose, some of them anyway, but they're just done so well that you just kind of go like, yeah, you know, like something like this, like the metaphor is so overwhelming that you kind of get it just by hearing the title, but the execution is quite good. Another one that is just kind of just such an obvious allegory, but it's so great is The Wound. The Wound is about a man who has pioneered a technique for drilling for oil by drilling a big hole in the ground and then blowing up a nuke. And basically the premise of the story is that he does this, and instead of oil, the earth starts bleeding. Blood starts blowing out of the wound he's created in the earth. Pretty straightforward, and the kind of iconic classic edition of this book, you can see this title does have an angel-like figure here, and there's maybe this red is meant to be some of the blood from the wound, but the kind of iconic art, which maybe I'll put in here somewhere, it does kind of have the body of the angel over inside a field of blood, representing the kind of these two stories are kind of make up the cover together. And it kind of makes you think of maybe the end of Evangelion a little bit. I would not be surprised to hear that was an influence on Hideaki Anno, although it seems like kind of a deep pull. I don't know if these stories were translated in Japanese or popular, but you know, who knows? Finally, my very, very favorite story of the collection is a story called Intermission. There is certainly still allegory and metaphor going on, but it is a much subtler and stranger story. And the premise is basically this man is driving at night, and these giant figures are rolling up the scenery of the planet. They're rolling up the mountains and the fields and the rivers like it's all artificial turf or whatever. They are rolling all the scenery up during the intermission before whatever is going to come after us happens. And it's kind of all of these, it's the story of these kind of like middle-aged or older people gathering at this club, like playing billiards, chatting, reflecting on their lives a little bit, while all around them, the world is literally being rolled up and put away. And it does, I kind of think, it's, very resonant. This is being written in the very early 70s, like there is some enormous change is about to happen. A previous generation is about to be replaced. And it's kind of a bittersweet feeling, there's like obviously the fear of death and what comes next, but also the knowledge that, as much as their personal lives may have been pleasant, the world that they were lived in was not necessarily a good world. And so they can only hope that something better comes. Yeah, so that's General Zapped an Angel. Finally, I have Swords and Deviltry by Fritz Lieber, the first book in the Fafhrd and the Great Mouser series, also called the Lankmar series. Swords Against is a common way of describing the series because the multiple books are Swords Against Death, Swords Against Wizardry, that kind of thing. These books are sword and sorcery. They were hugely influential in D&D. Fritz Lieber is just like a huge important figure in both science fiction and fantasy and horror. He was one of these guys, much like Ellison, who kind of wrote freely in all three genres. He probably, his first love, I think, probably was fantasy, and he would have been maybe a straight fantasy horror author if it wasn't for the fact that science fiction just owned the American market up until like the 70s, basically. It isn't really until the 80s that fantasy starts to roll a bit and start to get its momentum back. Prior to the 80s, it really is science fiction, science fiction, science fiction, even though there are books like this that did continue fantasy. And you could do a whole episode on this, and maybe I will, but Lieber, he originally wrote some Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories like back in the day in the 30s and 40s, or maybe the 40s and 50s, and they just didn't sell. He had to stop writing them because it just didn't work. And then basically then Lord of the Rings comes out, and it really opens up the market for fantasy, and he can start writing these stories again, and they kind of take off and grow a life of their own. So he's a really interesting author because of that. This is it's a cool book if you like fantasy, if you like Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's an important book to read, and I think it's good. It's enjoyable. I think it's a step below the other two collections for me. It really does just have this kind of, the tone is not necessarily my favorite. It's a little comedic in places. It's a little ironic. It doesn't quite have it's a little more like the Conan stories, despite clearly being like sword and sorcery. It's about, rough people that do rough work, but there is still like this elegance to the writing and this kind of brilliance to it. Not to disparage Lieber, but this does not have that. The prose is much more workaday. It has a bit of that pulpy attitude of the kind of the wink, the kind of like they're grinning while they're telling you this story, And that's not bad, but it's just not necessarily my favorite tone for this kind of story. But I think the stories are still strong. The last story is, I think, easily the strongest of the three, which is Ilmet and Lankmar. This volume is kind of like, basically it's these are not the first Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories chronologically, but it's the first book in the collected series because it kind of tells their origin story. So you get one story with the origin of how Fafhrd gets to Lankmar, one story with how the Grey Mouser gets to Lankmar, and the final story where they meet and become partners. I mean, it's content warning because it's like genuinely something really horrible happens in that story. It's very dark, but I think also very strong, and it is, I think, it feels the most like a real successor to Conan. The first two stories are like totally fine. I don't think they're bad, but they do have this kind of prequelitis feeling because they were clearly written after these characters were popular to give them backstories. They're fine, but like nothing special, I think. But the third story is very strong, but pretty brutal. So be aware of that going in, and kind of have your, maybe if you're concerned about content warnings, look those up. This is a cool book. I think it's worth reading if you're interested in fantasy and the history of fantasy, especially if you like D&D, because I think the people often point to Lord of the Rings because of the elves and dwarves and stuff, but this is way more the kind of blueprint for Dungeons and Dragons than Lord of the Rings ever was. All right, go check out my blog, link in the description. I review stuff. I talk about all sorts of things. I recently read Anne and Jeff Vandermeer's The Big Book of Science Fiction, which is a kind of historical science fiction collection. I may do a video on it someday, but I really thought it was better to work through it in prose first, so I put a review of that on the blog. I did another post talking about some of my thoughts on the history of science fiction and the importance of context and my journey into becoming a science fiction reader. Check all that out. I make zines as well. There's one that's up on my itch page. I'll put the link in the description, but I have a second one that may be out by the time this video goes up. That's an annual one, and then a second monthly or quarterly zine, I guess, will be going up soon-ish, next couple months. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching, and read some damn books.